Thank you, Mike, and good morning, everyone. And like Kim, I'm so excited about that this morning's conversation. Over the last 33 years, I've had various careers as a conductor, composer, creative director, an interfaith practitioner, as well as running a group of cultural enterprises. I suppose the common thread has always been, in what I do is how can we build global harmony through intercultural action? Rather than defining myself as a social entrepreneur, I've started defining myself as a cultural entrepreneur, which is how can we start to use market forces to motivate behavioral change. And finally, I just want to say we're living in these extraordinary times where technology allows us to scale and have impact across the globe. What we've seen over the last 15 years is the rise of social media, and in many ways that's created massive polarization across the world. I think this decade needs to be seen as the rise of technology, which is going to create good. Thank you. Yeah. And if I can just chime in as well, thanks, Mike. I think what we also need to do is create environments for businesses where they can start to, enter this world of creating social impact. And many of them are unable to do that because there's so many restrictions and they're not able to access public funds. And I think we probably almost need to have a paradigm shift now where we're seeing this explosion of social entrepreneurialism across the globe, but why can't every organization, regardless of whether it sits in these pure constructs of a profit entity or not-for-profit entity, because everyone's moving towards this mission-driven entity, how can we start to allow profit-based entities to be able to have impact and at the same time access public funds?
So I think one thing that I think actually is perhaps even part of the answer to what you're raising there is, well, how do we measure all this stuff? A lot of people out there would truthfully say, well, you can't really measure social impact. Well, I mean, you're probably, if anyone I've ever met, you're the person that would beg to differ on that one. So what tools do you see that are either already there or that are coming on the way in that shows the return on investment of doing good?
Yeah, thanks, Mike. Maybe I might start by talking about what do we mean by measuring social impact. So what we basically mean is the intent to create good, the intent to build human capacity, the intent to address global environmental challenges that we're facing today. And I said earlier on, we're living in this decisive decade and we need to act now. The main reason why we need to act now is because of environmental challenges. But there's a whole range of other challenges that we're experiencing across the globe. The Economic Institute for Peace, established here by someone in Sydney, Stephen Killalay, who I've met several times, developed a global peace index. And he's developed a whole range of indicators and factors that are these key pillars to measuring peace. And he's come up with all these numbers. And, if you think of the cost of conflict in the world, it equates to something like 13.5% of the world's GDP. So we're talking about $14 trillion. 75% of that conflict that we have in the world has a cultural dimension, according to the United Nations. But this notion of how do we measure impact, how do we measure impact that's going to create good, how it's going to create peace, isn't a new idea. The ancient Greeks, the word for peace is eirene, and that basically means how do we string all the different components that make up a well-balanced society into a state of equilibrium and make sure there aren't any weak links, because if we have a weak link, peace will fall over. So these aren't new concepts. But today we're living in a different age where we can start to have impact across the globe with technology, using algorithms. Our organization, after more than 6 years of research and development, putting a whole team of subject matter experts together from a whole range of different disciplines, developed a data-driven approach to measuring diversity. So we were able to unpack what we mean by diversity and then apply algorithms to that, which allow us to start to look at organizations so they could look internally and say, who are we now? Now, if we want to develop some diversity targets, how do we start to know whether we're more diverse now or less diverse in the future? So there is the capacity out there today to develop a whole range of different things. But I just want to mention a couple of other metrics which I think are really important and feed into today's Zoom session. If you think of the amount of global financial transactions that we have in the world, it equates, in 2019, it equated to around $14 quadrillion. This is the number 14 with 15 zeros after it. It's enormous. And then if you think of the amount of global card payments that are done every year, that equates to $40 trillion. I mean, this is an enormous amount. Now, think of the micro credentialing and the micro activity that can be attached to that, which can be directed towards good. And, Ivan Schwartz's idea of points for purpose can really start to transform the world and start to direct the individual, what the individual wants to do and where he wants to contribute his impact to. Thank you.
So what's the impact of COVID on giving or on shared value? What's the impact and what's the impact that will flow from that on business strategy, on marketing strategy? What do each one of you see the impacts flowing in this kind of space? I don't know who wants to start this one.
I'm happy to speak to that, Mike.
Thank you.
One of the things that the pandemic has highlighted is the sort of the disproportionate impact that government approaches, blanket approaches, are having in a whole lot of communities out there across the globe. So a lot of people are now just invisible. They're being completely left out. And what it's also done, it's really started to perpetuate and really perpetrate difference, polarization and poverty. And I think one of the main reasons is because we're never going to realize the true extent of what's going on until we can take a nuanced approach, until we can make sure we're not leaving anyone out during this time. So I'm talking more about the impact that COVID's having on people as opposed to the environment. But if it's having impact on people, then it's definitely having an impact on the environment. So I think the answer comes back to having better data that allows us to really take deep insights. And I think we're at a time now in humanity where we can do that. We couldn't do this prior to 1989. Tim Berners-Lee wasn't around. He invented the World Wide Web, and all of a sudden we found ourselves in this super diverse world, in this massive world where economic globalization took place, without globalization of ethics and values. And I think the work that needs to be done is how can we start to develop a global classification system, how we understand humanity and how we can get people to subscribe to this. And some of the work that we're doing now with global corporations is they're recognizing this. They're recognizing that there's not a global classification, and that creates all sorts of problems. And in some parts of the world, you can't even ask certain questions. So that creates all these unintended consequences. So I think now there needs to be a discussion about how can we start to create spaces that everyone feels safe to bring at least most aspects of their identity to that space. Because if we can do that, then we're going to discover more about them, and then we're going to be able to take this nuanced approach. And I think coming back to what I said earlier on, the last 15 years was the age of social media, and we've seen what that's done to the world. And in many ways, the rise of social media has coincided with the peace declining in the world, and there is data around that. And the Global Peace Index has got a lot of data around that. I think now this is the age where we use technology to create good and really take that data-driven approach to allow us to be able to measure impact. Thank you.
Brilliant.
And Mike, if I can also chime in and just add to this discussion, the last 33 years of my life has been trying to understand diversity. I coined the phrase "diversified we grow" for the United Nations back in 2013, and had the opportunity to deliver that slogan to a whole lot of heads of state and about 80 directors of ministers of culture across the globe. And when I coined that phrase, I wasn't just thinking about creating social cohesion. I was really thinking about how diversity of thought, leads to creativity and leads to innovation. Now, there's been some studies out there that show that diversity is not a good thing. And I agree with that. Diversity is not a good thing. But if you know how to manage diversity, then the benefits are overwhelmingly positive. And, and in my speech, when I presented it, I started to talk about history, and I started to look at some particular moments in history, such as, if you look at the numerical system we use today, which we've been using for the last 1,000 years, that wasn't one culture giving that to us. That was a whole range of different cultures, Arabic thought, Hindu thought, Hellenic thought, converging to create something that we're still using 1,000 years later. If you think of the contribution of the First Nations people, and we must listen to them more, and how they've learned to understand and live one with nature, and think of how many of our medicines have been derived from indigenous people, which have been using medicines for 50,000 years. So we need to really bring this diversity of thinking and try to create diverse environments, because that's going to help us solve these challenges. When I was in Jeddah last year, at the beginning of last year, for the Think 20, which was leading up to the G20, the Saudi Arabians are now building the very first carbon neutral desalination plant. Now, if you think of desalination plants here and how much energy they chew up, now how are they doing that? Well, they're saying we're going to open to the world. We want people to come to us. So they've built these huge teams and a convergence of so many different people from different parts of the world and different disciplines now, which is going to save us so much, greenhouse gases. So I think when we're working in this space, the more we can open up, the more we're going to be able to reduce the impact that we're going to start to experience in the next few years. Thanks.
Thanks, Peter.